My wife left me on a Tuesday morning while our son was at school. No argument. No warning. Just a note on the kitchen counter, her wedding ring on top of it, and two suitcases gone from the closet upstairs. The note said she'd found something better, that she'd been unhappy for longer than I realized, that she hoped I'd understand someday. She left with Richard Hartwell, her boss, 58 years old, the man whose name was on the building where she'd worked for 3 years. The man whose photograph I'd seen in the Charlotte Business Journal the previous month. Under the headline, Hartwell Capital Celebrates 20 Years of Regional Growth. I stood in that kitchen for a long time, holding a note written on the back of a grocery list, and I thought about Ethan, 6 years old, at school, completely unaware that by the time I picked him up that afternoon, his mother would already be gone. I didn't call her. I didn't call anyone. I just picked up her wedding ring from the counter, put it in the junk drawer, and drove to Ethan's school at 3 o'clock, the same way I always did. That was 8 months ago. Last week, a woman named Eleanor Sims called my cell phone, identified herself as the attorney for Hartwell Capital, and told me that Richard Hartwell needed to meet with me urgently about a family matter, not a legal matter, not a business matter, a family matter. And if you're already doing the math on that, good, because so was I, standing in the same kitchen where Vanessa left her wedding ring, understanding for the first time that the man my wife had left me for might have a reason to know my name that had nothing to do with her at all. Stay with me, because this story goes somewhere neither of us saw coming, and I'll see you on the other side of it. Before I tell you about Eleanor Sims and Richard Hartwell, I need to tell you about who Vanessa was when I married her, because I think it's the only way to make what happened later make sense. And because the woman who left that note on the kitchen counter was not the same woman I proposed to 8 years earlier. I met Vanessa at a mutual friend's birthday party in 2015. She was 28, working as a junior analyst at a mid-sized financial firm downtown, wearing a dress she'd clearly borrowed from someone, and laughing at something across the room with the particular, unguarded laugh of someone who hadn't yet learned to be careful about how they came across. I introduced myself because she looked like someone worth introducing myself to, and within 20 minutes, I'd confirmed that she was sharp, funny, genuinely curious about things, the kind of person who asked real questions and listened to the actual answers instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. I was 31, working remotely as a senior software engineer for a tech company headquartered in Seattle, which meant I could live anywhere, which had always suited me. I'd built a comfortable, quietly successful life that didn't require any particular geography to sustain. Good salary, fully remote, the kind of professional stability that makes certain other decisions easy. Charlotte was where my mother lived, which was reason enough to stay. Vanessa said yes at a restaurant on a Thursday evening and cried in the particular, completely genuine way of someone who prepared themselves to cry because they didn't know they were going to. And I thought, watching her across that table, that I'd found exactly the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life sitting across from. The first years were good. I want to say that simply and without qualification, because the story of what happened later can make it easy to revise the early years into something they weren't. They were genuinely good, easy in the specific way of two people who actually like each other, who find each other's company more comfortable than uncomfortable, who've built something real, rather than simply coexisting inside an arrangement that looks like something real. Ethan was born in 2018, and we became, almost overnight, the particular kind of tired that new parents become, and then the particular kind of competent that parents become once the tiredness becomes their permanent baseline. I took on more of the daily logistics, drop-offs, pickups, pediatrician appointments, the endless administrative labor of a small child's life, because Vanessa's hours were longer and my schedule was more flexible, and it simply made sense. The way things simply make sense in a marriage that's actually functioning. The changes started when she joined Hartwell Capital. Not immediately. That's what made them hard to see at first. She'd taken the position because it was a significant step up, better title, considerably better salary, the kind of opportunity that comes once and that you take without overthinking it. I was glad for her. I remember saying, the night she told me she'd gotten the offer, that I thought she'd been too good for where she was for at least 2 years. She was, I think, genuinely happy for the first several months. She came home energized, in the way people come home energized when work is actually engaging them rather than just occupying them. Talking about deals she was working on, about the particular intellectual satisfaction of the work itself. I listened to those conversations the way I'd always listened, completely, because she was interesting, and what she was doing was interesting, and I'd never once stopped finding her interesting, even after 8 years of marriage. The first thing I noticed, so small I dismissed it the first few times, was a change in how she talked about the office, specifically about Richard Hartwell. He went from being my boss to being Richard, to being Richard says, and Richard thinks with increasing frequency, the particular verbal shift of someone who started organizing their professional worldview around a single person's perspective. I noticed it. I filed it. I told myself it was normal. He was her boss. He was charismatic. Influential people have a way of filling up the conversational space of the people who work closely with them. I'd done the same thing about a manager I'd admired early in my career, and it had meant nothing. I was right that it can mean nothing. I was wrong about this specific instance. The second thing I noticed was a change in how she looked at the life we'd built, not dramatically, not with stated dissatisfaction or explicit complaints, at least not at first. More as a kind of subtle recalibration, the way you'd recalibrate a lens to bring a different thing into focus. She started mentioning the neighborhood more. Not badly, exactly, but with the particular noting of its limitations that people do when they're beginning to measure their current situation against something they've decided they'd prefer. She started talking about cars, about vacations, about the kind of social events that Hartwell Capital apparently attended and that our life didn't currently include. I listened to these conversations too, with a different quality of attention than the earlier ones. The way you listen when you're no longer just hearing someone, but also trying to hear what's underneath what they're saying. What was underneath, I came to understand too late, was a woman who had walked into a world that looked more like the life she'd always imagined having than the one she'd built, and who was beginning, quietly and probably without fully admitting it even to herself, to want to stay inside that world rather than return to ours. The third thing I noticed was Ethan. Not that she stopped loving him, I don't believe that, even now. But the way she was with him changed in small ways that were hard to articulate and impossible to raise as a direct conversation. She was more distracted during dinner. She started taking calls after his bedtime that ran longer than they used to, standing in the kitchen in the particular posture of someone who'd prefer not to be overheard. She started missing the small rituals of his day, the specific questions he wanted answered before bed, the particular sequence of things that made his mornings manageable in ways that required me to cover for her so he wouldn't notice. I covered for her. I want to be honest about that. I smoothed things over, made excuses, absorbed the gap between the parent he needed and the one who was present, because that was what the situation required, and because I still believed in the months before that Tuesday morning that whatever was happening was temporary, was stress, was a phase of adjustment to a demanding new role rather than a direction she'd already decided to move in. I was wrong about that too. The last real conversation we had, real in the sense of honest, both of us actually present rather than performing some version of presence, happened about 3 weeks before she left. We were in the kitchen after Ethan was asleep, and I finally said the thing I'd been building toward for months, that I could feel her pulling away, that I didn't fully understand why, that I needed her to tell me what was actually happening rather than let us drift further into a version of our life where we were both pretending things were fine when they clearly weren't. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read and said, I just think I need more than this, Daniel. I think I've always needed more than this, and I didn't know it until recently. I asked what more than this meant. She didn't answer directly. She said she was tired, went to bed, and 3 weeks later, I found a note on the kitchen counter with her wedding ring on top of it. I've thought about that conversation many times since. about what she meant by more than this. Whether she meant more than me specifically, more than our life specifically, more than the specific version of herself she'd been inside our marriage. I've never fully resolved which one she meant, and I've come to believe it probably doesn't matter, because the answer to all three of them, for Vanessa by that point, was the same. What I know is that she walked out of our kitchen and into Richard Hartwell's world, and that 8 months later, his attorney called my phone about a family matter, and that when I finally understood what that family matter actually was, the specific, ironic geometry of the whole thing was almost too precise to believe. Almost. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because I think being careful about it is the only way to tell it honestly. I don't know everything that happened between Vanessa and Richard Hartwell. I wasn't there. What I know, I've pieced together from things Vanessa eventually told me during the divorce proceedings. Not voluntarily, not generously, but in the careful, partial way people tell you things when they're legally required to and are trying to give you the minimum that satisfies the requirement without giving you the full picture. The rest I've inferred from what I know about how these things work, which to say from common sense rather than surveillance. Richard Hartwell was, by every account I'd encountered before any of this happened, a genuinely impressive man. Self-made in the specific way that people who've built something significant from a standing start are self-made. Not born into ease, but disciplined and focused and willing to make decisions that required a certain kind of nerve. He'd started Hartwell Capital at 38 with his own money and 2 employees, and had grown it over 20 years into one of the more significant private investment firms in Charlotte's financial community. He was also, by the time Vanessa joined his company, 57 years old and widowed. His wife had died of cancer 6 years earlier, leaving him in the specific, particular solitude of a man who'd built an impressive professional world and an empty personal one, whose days were full and whose evenings were not. I'm not telling you this to make you sympathize with him. I'm telling you because I think it's the honest text for what happened, and because I've found, in the year since all of this, that understanding something and forgiving it are not the same operation, and you can do the first without having to do the second. Vanessa joined Hartwell Capital as a senior analyst in January of her second year there. She'd been promoted from junior analyst, which was legitimately earned. She was good at the work, genuinely good, the kind of good that gets noticed in environments where performance is tracked carefully. Richard Hartwell noticed her the way people who pay close attention to talent notice talent directly, specifically, with the particular focus of someone who understood what they were looking at. He started including her in higher-level meetings, then in client dinners, then in the kind of strategy conversations that don't happen in conference rooms, over meals, in the particular intimacy of two people working through a complex problem together in close proximity over an extended period of time. I understand, intellectually, how that progression happens. The professional intimacy of working closely with someone capable and focused is genuinely seductive in ways that have nothing to do with physical attraction. Initially, it's the intimacy of being seen clearly in a professional context, of having your thinking valued and your judgment trusted by someone whose own judgment you respect. It's a real thing, that kind of connection, and it can develop into something else before either person has fully acknowledged that it's developing. I'm not making excuses for Vanessa. I want to be completely clear about that. She made choices at each step of that progression, and the choices she made eventually included deciding that what she was building with Richard Hartwell was worth more to her than what she'd built with me and our son. That was her choice, made by an adult who understood what she was doing. What I've had to make peace with over the past year is the specific way she made it. Not with honesty, not with a conversation that gave me the chance to respond, but with a note on a kitchen counter and a wedding ring, and a version of the truth that was designed to require as little of her as possible. She called me once, about 2 weeks after she left, ostensibly to discuss the logistics of the divorce, but actually, I think, to see if I was going to be difficult about things. I wasn't. I was, by that point, past the particular anger that wants to make things difficult and into something colder and more practical. I needed this resolved, clearly and completely, in a way that protected Ethan's stability as much as anything could be protected when a parent chooses to leave. She mentioned Richard in that conversation. Carefully. The way you mention something you know is going to land badly, and are trying to land as gently as possible. She said she understood how it looked, but that what had developed between them was real. That she wasn't proud of how it had happened, but that she believed it was right. That she hoped, eventually, I'd understand. I didn't say much in response. I asked about the divorce timeline, about the custody arrangement she had in mind, about the practical questions that needed answering regardless of anything else. She answered them, and we hung up, and I sat for a while in the quiet of the house that was mine now. Mine and Ethan's, the two of us navigating a restructured life that neither of us had chosen, and I thought about what she'd said. What had developed between them was real. I didn't doubt that. I'd stopped doubting that particular thing fairly early because I'd seen enough in the months before she left to understand that whatever she felt for Richard Hartwell was genuinely felt rather than strategically performed. The particular tragedy of the situation wasn't that she'd faked something. It was that she'd found something real and decided it was worth the specific cost of getting it. The cost being our son growing up in a household where one parent had decided he was a reasonable thing to leave behind. I want to say that plainly because I think it's the part of this that people sometimes soften, and I'm not interested in softening it. Ethan was 6 years old. He asked me the Tuesday night she left, when Mommy was coming back for dinner, and I sat at our kitchen table and told him, as honestly and as gently as a 6-year-old's question could be answered, that Mommy was going to be living somewhere else for a while, and that she loved him very much, and that that wasn't going to change. He thought about this for a long moment, with the focused, careful attention he brought to anything that required him to reorganize his understanding of something. But she'll still come to my soccer games? He asked. Yes, I told him. She'll still come to your soccer games. She came to the first two. Then her attendance became less consistent, in ways she always had explanations for, and Ethan stopped asking about it with the particular quiet adaptation of a child, learning not to expect something that isn't reliably there. That's the part I haven't forgiven. I want to be honest about that too. I've found room somewhere in the past year for a kind of understanding about what happened between Vanessa and Richard Hartwell, because I'm capable of understanding how people end up in the situations they end up in, even when those situations cost other people dearly. But the soccer games I haven't forgiven, because Ethan's consistency of expectation had nothing to do with what was or wasn't working between his parents. And she chose to make it variable anyway. That choice belongs to her. I've let it stay there. What I didn't know through any of this, through the Tuesday morning note and the divorce proceedings and the soccer games and the 8 months of rebuilding a life that worked for two people instead of three, was that the man she'd chosen was carrying a secret of his own that was about to make the geometry of the entire situation considerably more complicated than anyone in it had anticipated, including me, especially me. The first thing I did the morning after Vanessa left was make Ethan's lunch. Not because I was holding it together. Not because I'd processed anything or found some reservoir of composure that the situation required. I made his lunch because it was 6:45 in the morning and he needed to be at school by 8, and the lunch wasn't going to make itself, and because I've found in the years since that the most reliable way through impossible mornings is to find the next specific, concrete thing that needs doing and do it. Ham sandwich. The crusts cut off the way he liked. Apple slices in a separate bag so they didn't make the bread soggy. His water bottle filled. His backpack by the door. I did all of it on autopilot, moving through our kitchen with the efficient muscle memory of 6 years of school mornings, while some very still, somewhere deeper, holding a note on a grocery list and a wedding ring in a junk drawer, doing the particular, quiet work of understanding that the life I'd had yesterday was not the life I was going to have today. Ethan came downstairs at 7, his hair still half standing from sleep, dragging the stuffed elephant he'd slept with since he was 2. He asked where Mommy was. I gave him the answer I'd been composing in my head since I'd found the note. Calm, honest, age-appropriate. The version that was true without being more than a 6-year-old needed to carry. He ate his cereal. He asked about the soccer game on Saturday. I told him I'd be there. He seemed to accept this as sufficient, the way children accept things as sufficient when they're being given enough to understand the immediate situation and enough love to feel safe inside it, even when the situation is actually enormous. I drove him to school. I watched him walk through the entrance doors without looking back, which was what he always did. He'd always been the kid who went in without looking back, self-possessed in the way that some children simply are from the beginning, as if they arrived in the world already knowing they could handle whatever was in front of them. I sat in the parking lot for a while after he went in. Then I drove home and called my mother. My mother, Joyce Marsh, is the kind of woman who receives bad news by going very quiet and then very practical, in that order. She went quiet when I told her. Then she asked when she could come over. "This weekend," I said. "I'm fine until the weekend." "You're not fine," she said. "I know," I said, "but I can manage not fine until the weekend." She came Friday evening, let herself in with her key, and spent the first hour cooking things she put in labeled containers in my freezer, without asking whether I wanted them, which is how Joyce Marsh expresses love, through the practical removal of future problems. I sat at the kitchen table and watched her move through my kitchen and felt, for the first times since Tuesday morning, something that wasn't grief or anger or the specific, focused adrenaline of getting through what needed getting through, just the particular comfort of a parent who showed up. My mother asked, carefully, over dinner, whether I was managing everything: the work, Ethan's school schedule, the logistics of a life that had been built for 3 people, now running on 1. I told her honestly that I was managing it, that working remotely was a significant advantage, that Ethan's school had a before and after care program that covered the gaps, that we'd settled into a routine that worked. What I didn't tell her, what I was still figuring out how to tell myself, was how much smaller the house felt with one fewer person in it who was supposed to be there. Not Vanessa specifically, or not only Vanessa, but the version of the future I'd been living inside, the one where Ethan grew up with both parents in the same house, where the rhythms of a family of 3 continued to organize the days the way they had for 6 years. That version had simply stopped being the version I was living in. And the adjustment to the new one was happening in places I didn't know how to articulate, in the specific, wordless ways that significant losses happen in the body before the mind has fully processed them. The week settled into a routine with the practicality of necessity. Up at 6:30, Ethan's lunch, school drop-off, work from 7:30 to 3, the particular focused efficiency of a man with no flexibility in his schedule, and a hard stop for pickup. Ethan's homework, dinner, bath, the specific sequence of bedtime rituals he required, and that I performed without variation. Because variation, in the weeks after his mother left, felt like a risk I wasn't willing to take with the one part of his day that was still entirely predictable. After he was asleep, I worked again, finishing things I hadn't had time for during the day, and then sat for a while in the quiet of a house that was finally genuinely quiet, doing the internal accounting that I couldn't do with him present. What I was feeling, what I needed, what the next week required that the current week hadn't yet addressed. I want to tell you about Ethan during those months, because I think he's the most important part of this story, in ways that don't always get acknowledged in the version where the dramatic twist eventually arrives. He was 6 years old, and his mother had left, and he processed it the way he processed everything, with a focused, methodical attention that would have been remarkable in an adult, and that in a 6-year-old was both impressive and quietly heartbreaking to witness. He asked questions when he had them, clearly and directly, without the performance of distress that sometimes accompanies children working through difficult things. When I answered them, he listened completely, considered them, and moved on. Not because he wasn't affected, but because he was, I came to understand, choosing to be functional over the alternative, the same way I was choosing it. He started drawing more during those months. He'd always been a child who drew careful, detailed drawings of buildings and machines, and things he was trying to understand by rendering them. But the volume increased in the months after Vanessa left, the way any child's primary coping mechanism intensifies under pressure. I have a stack of drawings from those months that I've kept in a folder in my desk. I look at them sometimes. They're mostly houses, different kinds, different sizes, approached from different angles, but houses consistently, in the way that a child working something out draws the thing they're working it out about. He was working out what a home was, I think, what made one, whether ours still qualified. I believe, and I believe it with more certainty now than I had at the time, that it did, that what we'd built in those months, the two of us, in the house that used to be 3 and was now 2, was genuinely a home, imperfect and restructured, and missing something real, but still fundamentally the thing it needed to be. A place where a child was known, and safe, and loved without reservation. He brought me one of the drawings about 3 months after Vanessa left, on a Saturday morning, while I was drinking coffee at the kitchen table. He stood in front of me with the drawing held out flat, the careful way he always presented things he considered finished, and explained it to me with the same seriousness he brought to everything. It was our house. Recognizable, the specific shape of the roof, the tree in the front yard, the number on the mailbox rendered with impressive accuracy for a 6-year-old, 2 figures standing in front of it, one tall and one small, both with their hands up in the particular way stick figures wave when they want to indicate that they're happy. That's us, he said, pointing at the 2 figures. I made us bigger than the house because that's the important part. I looked at that drawing for a long moment, and then I looked at my son, standing in front of me in his Saturday pajamas, with the stuffed elephant tucked under one arm, entirely matter of fact about what he just said. You're right, I told him. That's the important part. He nodded, took the drawing back, and went to put it on the refrigerator himself, because he'd decided it belonged there. It's still there. I haven't taken it down. And it was 3 weeks after that Saturday morning, with Ethan's drawing of the 2 of us still on the refrigerator, that Eleanor Sims called my phone and said that Richard Hartwell needed to meet with me about a family matter. Eleanor Sims called on a Wednesday afternoon, while I was in the middle of a code review that I immediately stopped being able to focus on. She introduced herself precisely: attorney at law, general counsel for Hartwell Capital, calling on behalf of Richard Hartwell personally rather than the firm, a distinction she made carefully enough that I understood it was intentional. She had a measured, unhurried voice, the particular voice of someone who delivers difficult information professionally and has learned, over years of doing it, that pace matters more than almost anything else when the information is significant. Mr. Marsh, she said, I want to be direct with you, because I think directness is the most respectful approach here. Mr. Hartwell has asked me to contact you because there's a matter of a personal and legal nature that he believes involves you directly. He'd like to meet with you at your earliest convenience to discuss it in person. I said nothing for a moment. On my monitor, the code review waited, patient and irrelevant. What kind of matter? I asked. A family matter, she said. I understand that word probably raises immediate questions, given the current circumstances between you and your former wife. I want to be clear that this is entirely unrelated to your divorce proceedings or to Mr. Hartwell's relationship with Ms. Vanessa Marsh. This predates all of that considerably. I sat with that sentence for a moment. This predates all of that considerably. How considerably? I asked. A pause, not long, just the brief pause of someone choosing their words carefully. Mr. Marsh, I think this conversation would be better had in person, with Mr. Hartwell present. What I can tell you is that he believes this meeting is important, that it's time-sensitive given his current health situation, and that what he has to tell you is something he should have addressed much earlier, and takes full responsibility for not having done. His current health situation, another carefully placed phrase. Is he ill? I asked. He's managing a cardiac condition, she said. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but the situation has prompted him to put certain things in order that he acknowledges he should have put in order years ago. I looked at Ethan's drawing on the refrigerator from where I sat at my desk. The 2 figures standing in front of our house, hands raised, bigger than the house because that was the important part, and felt something shift in my chest that I couldn't fully name yet. When does he want to meet? I asked. As soon as you're available, she said. He suggested this week if possible. His office or a location of your choosing, wherever you'd be most comfortable. I thought about that, about the specific geometry of walking into Richard Hartwell's office building, whose name was on the outside of it, where Vanessa had worked for 3 years, where whatever had happened between them had happened, about whether I could sit across a desk from this man in that building and have whatever conversation he wanted to have. Not his office, I said. Of course, Eleanor Sims said without missing a beat. Name the place. I chose a coffee shop near my house. Neutral ground, public without being crowded, the kind of place where a conversation can be private enough to matter without being isolated enough to feel like a corner. I gave her the name and address. We agreed on Friday morning, 9 o'clock, while Ethan was at school. After I hung up, I sat for a long time without moving, the phone still in my hand, the code review still waiting on my monitor. I ran through every possible explanation for what a family matter that predated my divorce and my marriage might be. The list was not long, and the entries on it were not small. I called my mother that evening after Ethan was asleep and told her about the call. She listened without interrupting, the way she always listened to significant things, completely, with the particular quality of attention that I'd always found both comforting and slightly unnerving, because it suggested she was taking in more than what was being said. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did you tell her?" I said I'd meet him Friday, I said. "Mom, do you have any idea what this could be about?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Daniel," she said, and something in her voice was different. Careful in a specific way I hadn't heard before. The way people sound when they're choosing between two versions of what they're about to say. "I think you should go to the meeting. And I think, after you've heard what he has to say, you should call me right away." "That's not an answer to what I asked," I said. "I know," she said. "Call me after the meeting." I stayed on the phone for another few minutes, pushing gently in several directions, and she held her ground with the quiet, complete firmness of a woman who had decided something and wasn't going to be moved from it by anything short of the right moment. I went to bed that night, turning the conversation over, reading her careful non-answer, the way you read something in a language you mostly know but haven't used in a while. Understanding the individual words clearly, uncertain about what they added up to. What I knew was this. My mother had heard me describe a call from Richard Hartwell's attorney about a family matter that predated my marriage, and she had not expressed surprise. She had expressed something else, something that felt, in retrospect, like the specific quality of attention a person gives to information they've been waiting for a very long time to hear. I didn't sleep well that Thursday night. I drove Ethan to school Friday morning, watched him go through the entrance doors without looking back, and then drove to the coffee shop and arrived 12 minutes early, and sat at a corner table and ordered coffee I didn't drink and waited. Richard Hartwell walked in at 9 o'clock exactly. Alone, no Eleanor Sims, no assistant, no buffer of any kind. He was taller than I'd expected from his photographs, thinner than the man on the Charlotte Business Journal cover, moving with the slightly careful deliberateness of someone managing a body that wasn't quite cooperating with what he asked of it. He found me immediately. He stopped when he saw me, just briefly, at the entrance, and something crossed his face that I couldn't fully read. Recognition, maybe, or something more complicated than recognition, something that required more context than I had to understand it. He walked to my table and sat down across from me. And for a moment, neither of us said anything, both of us doing the same thing, looking at the other person and understanding, somewhere underneath the words that hadn't been said yet, that this was not the conversation either of us had entirely prepared ourselves for. "Thank you for coming," he said finally. "You said it was time-sensitive," I said. "I figured whatever it is, it should probably be said." He nodded slowly, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup a server had placed in front of him, and looked at me across the table with the particular tired directness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally arrived at the moment he puts it down. "I don't know how to begin this," he said, "except to say that I should have begun it a long time ago, and that I didn't, and that I'm sorry for that before I've even told you what I'm sorry for." I waited. I knew your mother, he said. Joyce Marsh. I knew her in 1985 in Raleigh when she was 23 years old and I was 26, and neither of us had anything we have now. He stopped, looked at me. I think you may already understand where this is going. I did, and I didn't. Both things, at the same time, with a clarity that arrived before I was ready for it, and that sat in my chest like something physical, solid, and heavy, and impossible to put back once it had arrived. Tell me anyway, I said. Say it plainly. He looked at me across that coffee shop table. This man whose name was on buildings in this city, whose company my wife had joined, and whose orbit had pulled her away from our kitchen table and our son's soccer games, Mrs. And he said the thing he'd apparently been building toward for 38 years. I'm your father, Daniel, he said. And I've known about you since before you were born, and I didn't do right by you or your mother, and I am here now, too late and inadequately, because I'm running out of time to keep not doing right by you. The coffee shop moved around us in its ordinary Friday morning way, entirely indifferent. I picked up my cup, took a sip of coffee that had gone cold, and set it back down. Tell me everything, I said. From the beginning. Leave nothing out. I called my mother from the parking lot of the coffee shop, still sitting in my car, the engine off, the Friday morning traffic, moving past the windshield in its ordinary, entirely unaware way. She picked up on the second ring. He told me, I said. A silence. Not the silence of surprise, the silence of a woman who has been waiting 38 years for a specific phone call and is now finally receiving it and needs a moment to arrive inside that moment before she can speak. I know, she said finally. You've known, I said, this whole time, my entire life. Yes, she said. Simply directly, without defense or deflection. I've known your entire life. I sat with that for a moment. The specific weight of it, the 38 years of a truth that had been present in every conversation we'd ever had. In every question I'd asked about my father that she'd answered with the careful, partial version she decided I needed. In every moment of my childhood, and adolescence, and adult life that had been organized around the fact of an absent father, without ever naming the father specifically. I need to come to you, I said. Today. Can Ethan stay with the neighbors tonight? I'll call Susan, she said. Susan was our neighbor 2 houses down, who'd watched Ethan dozens of times, and who Ethan considered a secondary grandmother. Come, whenever you're ready. I drove to Ethan's school, explained to the office that there was a family situation and that Susan Chen would be picking him up at 3, confirmed with Susan, and then drove the 40 minutes to my mother's house in the particular, focused silence of someone who needs the driving to do the work of transition, to carry them from one version of their understanding to the next. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She'd been watching for me, which she'd never once in my life admitted to doing, and had always done anyway. She looked, I thought, smaller than she had the previous weekend. Or, not smaller exactly, more present, in the specific way that people become more present when they've stopped holding something back. Like the holding had been taking up space that was now available for something else. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table I'd sat at, for homework as a child, for holiday dinners, for the careful, partial conversations about my father that had been true in every detail except the one that mattered most. And she put coffee in front of me and sat across from me and folded her hands on the table the way she did when she was preparing to tell me something difficult. Tell me everything, I said. The real version, all of it. So she did. She met Richard Hartwell in Raleigh in the summer of 1985. She was 23, working as a bookkeeper for a small construction company, sharing an apartment with 2 friends in the particular chapter of early adulthood where the future is entirely open and entirely uncertain, and both of those things feel more exciting than frightening. He was 26, 3 years out of business school, working 70-hour weeks at an investment firm where he was trying to build the credibility that would eventually allow him to go out on his own. They met at a 4th of July party at a mutual friend's apartment. They talked for most of the night. They exchanged numbers, and he called the next day. And what followed was 4 months of a relationship that was, she was careful about this, deliberate about the words she chose, genuinely good, in the way that things are genuinely good when both people are fully present in them and not yet aware of the complications that will eventually make them impossible. The complication, in this case, was Richard's family. His father, the senior Hartwell, patriarch of what was then a moderately successful Charlotte real estate family, had opinions about the kind of woman his son would eventually marry. Opinions that were shaped by the particular ugly logic of a certain generation of Southern money. And that made Joyce Marsh, daughter of a Raleigh schoolteacher, categorically unacceptable regardless of anything else about her. Richard told her in October of 1985 that he thought they needed to end things. He was not cruel about it. My mother was careful to say this, in a way that told me she'd thought about how to say it many times. He was honest, actually, in a way that cost him something to be honest about. That he was being pressured by his family, that he didn't have the nerve to defy them, that he was 26 years old and not yet the person he needed to be to make the choice that the situation actually required. She told him she was pregnant 2 weeks later. I looked at her across the table when she said this, and she looked back at me steadily, and neither of us said anything for a moment. What did he do? I asked. He came to see me, she said, in person the same week I told him. He sat in this kitchen, not this kitchen, the apartment, but the same kind of conversation at the same kind of table. And he told me he was sorry, that he wanted to do the right thing, but that he didn't know what the right thing was, and that his family. She stopped, took a breath. He was 26 years old, and he was afraid of his father, Daniel. I'm not excusing it. I'm just telling you what it was. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him I didn't need him to do anything, she said. I told him I was going to have the baby, and that I was going to raise the baby myself, and that I didn't want anything from him that he wasn't prepared to give freely, because anything given under obligation wasn't something I was interested in having. She looked at her hands. I was 23 years old, and I was furious, and I was heartbroken, and I was absolutely certain that I meant every word of what I said. And he let you mean it, I said. He let me mean it, she confirmed. He left Raleigh the following month. His firm transferred him to Charlotte, which I've always thought was not a coincidence. And I didn't hear from him again for 7 years. 7 years, I said. He reached out in 1992, she said. You were 5. He'd started Hartwell Capital by then, and I think the success had given him enough distance from his father's influence to start being honest with himself about what he'd done. He wrote me a letter. A real one, handwritten. He said he wanted to know if there was anything he could do, if there was any way he could be part of your life that I'd be open to. What did you say? My mother looked at me directly, with the particular expression of a woman who made a decision she's been living with for 33 years and has made her peace with it without having fully forgiven herself for it. I said no, she said. I told him you were 5 years old and your life was stable and you were happy, and that introducing a father who'd been absent since before you were born into that stability was not something I was willing to do without being certain it was right for you. And I told him that if he wanted to try again when you were older, when you could understand more, he could reach out then. He never did, I said. He sent money, she said, consistently every month from 1992 until you finished college. Not an enormous amount, enough to matter, not enough to create a dependence. I put most of it in the account that paid for your education. She paused. I should have told you about that. I told myself I was protecting you, and I was. But I was also protecting myself from a conversation I didn't know how to have. I sat with all of it. The letter in 1992, the money, the 33 years of careful, partial truth, and tried to organize it into something I could hold. He has a cardiac condition, I said finally. He's putting things in order. I know, my mother said. Eleanor Sims called me before she called you. She asked if I had any objection to Richard approaching you directly. I told her I didn't. I told her it was long overdue. She looked at me. I should have told you myself, Daniel, years ago. I don't have a defense for not having done that, except that it got harder to start that conversation the longer I waited. And the longer I waited, the more impossible starting it felt. And eventually I convinced myself that maybe it would never need to be started at all. Until his attorney called, I said. Until his attorney called, she confirmed. We sat in her kitchen for another 2 hours, the coffee going cold and then being replaced and going cold again, going back and forth through 38 years of a story that had been present in my life the entire time. Without having a shape I could see clearly, she answered everything I asked. Directly, completely, without the careful partiality of the version she'd told me my whole life. By the time I drove home, the Friday evening settling around Charlotte in its ordinary way, I understood something I hadn't understood that morning. That the story of my life had always had more people in it than I'd been allowed to see. That Richard Hartwell had been a presence in it. Through the monthly money, through my mother's careful management of what I knew, through the specific shape of the absence that had organized so much of how I understood myself, in ways that had never had a name. He had a name now. And what I had to decide, sitting in my car in my driveway with Ethan's drawing, still visible through the kitchen window from where I was parked, was what to do with a name that had arrived 38 years late, carried by a man who was also, improbably and uncomfortably, and in ways I hadn't yet finished processing, the same man my wife had left me to be with. The specific irony of that geometry was, I thought, either the universe's idea of a joke or its idea of an answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. I wasn't sure yet which one. We met again the following Wednesday, this time, at Richard's request and at a location he chose. Not his office, not a coffee shop, but his home, a house in Myers Park that I'd driven past 100 times without ever having a reason to look at, specifically. The kind of house that announces its own significance so quietly that you almost don't notice it doing it. Eleanor Sims met me at the door, took my coat, and showed me to a study at the back of the house that looked, I thought, like the room a man retreats to when he needs to think. Books on 3 walls, a desk that was clearly actually used rather than displayed, 2 chairs angled toward a fireplace that had a small, contained fire going despite the mild October weather. The kind of fire you light for comfort rather than warmth. Richard was standing when I came in, which I understood as a deliberate choice, meeting me on his feet rather than from behind a desk, removing the particular hierarchy that a desk creates between people. He shook my hand with both of his, the specific grip of someone communicating something beyond a greeting. "Thank you for coming back," he said. "I know Friday was a great deal to absorb." "It was," I said. I talked to my mother. Something moved across his face. "How is she?" "She's well," I said. "She told me everything. Her version of it." He nodded slowly, and I saw him absorb the implication of her version, that there might be differences in the accounts, that I was being careful not to assume his version and hers were identical. "I'd like to hear your version," I said. So he told it. Sitting across from me in that study, with the small fire going and Eleanor Sims having quietly closed the door behind her when she'd shown me in, he told me the 1985 version of a story my mother had told me from her side the previous Friday. The broad outlines matched. The details filled in things she'd left out. Not because she'd been dishonest, but because she'd only had access to her own experience of it. What it had looked like from inside the relationship, not from inside the decision he'd made to end it. He told me about his father with a candor that I could see cost him something. The specific ugly arithmetic of a man who'd built modest wealth through the particular social architecture of mid-century tree Charlotte, who'd held opinions about family and suitability that he'd never once been challenged to examine because nobody had ever required him to, and who'd communicated those opinions to his son with the quiet and questioned of a patriarch who'd never had to ask for compliance because compliance had always been given. Because compliance had always been given. I was 26, Richard said, and I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway because I was afraid of what it would cost me to do the right thing, and I wasn't yet the person who understood that the cost of doing the wrong thing is always higher. He looked at his hands. "It's an inadequate explanation. I'm not offering it as a defense. I'm offering it because you asked for my version, and that's honestly what it was. When my mother told you she was pregnant," I said, "what did you actually want to do?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Stay," he said finally. "I wanted to stay. I was terrified and I wanted to stay, and I left anyway, and I've thought about that specific moment more times than I can count over the past 38 years. I believed him. I want to be honest about that. Not because it resolved anything, not because wanting and doing are the same thing and he'd done the wrong thing regardless of what he'd wanted, but because I could hear in it the specific register of truth rather than performance, the particular flatness of something said too many times in private to require any external polish. You sent money, I said, from 1992. From the month after I reached out to your mother and she told me what she told me, he said. It was the only thing she'd accept. And I understood why. And I sent it because it was something concrete I could do that she couldn't fully refuse. I didn't know about it until Friday, I said. He nodded. I thought you might not. I asked Eleanor to reach out to Joyce before we called you, partly to make sure she knew this was happening, and partly because he stopped. Partly because I needed to know she was all right. Before I brought this into your life, I wanted to know she was all right. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over. She's all right, I said. She's been all right for 38 years. She built something complete without you, and I'm the evidence of it, and I think you know that. I do know that, he said. It's one of the things I'm most grateful for, and one of the things I'm most ashamed of simultaneously. She did something I was supposed to do with her, and she did it alone, and she did it well. And that's not a thing I get to take credit for. The DNA test had been arranged by Eleanor Sims through a service that handled these things with the particular discretion that significant financial situations require. Richard had provided his sample 2 weeks before Eleanor called me. My sample was taken by a technician who came to my house the Thursday after the coffee shop meeting. A Wednesday's worth of my mother's conversation, already sitting in my chest, making the whole thing feel less like a revelation in progress and more like a formality being completed. The results, which Eleanor delivered to both of us simultaneously the Tuesday after our Myers Park meeting, confirmed what neither of us, by that point, actually needed a test to confirm. Paternity established. Confidence level conclusive. I read the results at my kitchen table, with Ethan's drawing still on the refrigerator, and the Tuesday morning light coming through the window the way it always did, and I felt something that I'm still not sure I have accurate language for. Not joy, not grief, not anger, but something that contained elements of all three, and was also, underneath all of them, simply the particular feeling of a question that has been open your entire life, finally, irrevocably closing. Richard called that afternoon. Not Eleanor, Richard himself, which I noticed. I've seen the results, he said. So have I said. A pause. I'd like to talk about what comes next, he said. When you're ready. There's no urgency in the sense of pressure. I want you to take whatever time you need, but there are things that need to be addressed, legally and otherwise, and I want to address them with you rather than around you. What kind of things? I asked. The estate, he said, my will, what I've built and who I intend it to go to. A pause. I don't have other children, Daniel. I've never remarried. What I have, I built alone, and I'd like to leave it to the person who should have been part of building it with me if I'd done what I should have done 38 years ago. I looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. Two figures in front of a house, hands raised, bigger than the house, because that was the important part. I need time, I said. Take it, he said. I'm not going anywhere. I set the phone down and sat for a long time in the particular quiet of a life that had just changed shape again. Not the way it had changed shape on the Tuesday Vanessa left, not the grief and restructuring of that, but differently. In a way that felt less like something taken away and more like something added, complicating and unexpected, and not yet entirely nameable. What I knew, sitting in that kitchen on that Tuesday afternoon, was that Richard Hartwell was my father, that he'd known it for 38 years and had made choices, early and late, that had cost both of us something real, that he was now, with the particular urgency of a man who understood he had less time than he'd once assumed, trying to address what was addressable, and that my wife, my former wife, the woman who'd left a note on a kitchen counter and a wedding ring on top of it, had walked out of my life and into the life of the man who, it turned out, had been the most significant absent presence in mine for 38 years. I hadn't yet decided what to do with the specific, precise irony of that, but I was starting to understand that deciding was going to require me to sit across from Richard Hartwell one more time. Not as the man whose attorney had called about a family matter, not as the man my wife had left me for, but as something more complicated and more true than either of those things, as my father. Inadequate and late and genuinely trying in the specific way of people who have run out of time to keep not trying. The way Vanessa found out was, in retrospect, almost inevitable. The kind of inevitability that only becomes visible after the fact, when you can see how many separate threads were always going to converge at the same point, regardless of what anyone did to prevent it. Richard told her himself, not deliberately, not as a revelation, engineered for effect, but in the way that significant personal news eventually makes its way into even carefully managed conversations through the specific gravity of something that's taking up most of a person's internal space and eventually finds its way into the room, whether or not they intended to bring it there. It happened at dinner, about 2 weeks after the DNA results came back. Richard had, by his own account, been distracted through most of the meal, present physically, elsewhere mentally, in the particular way of someone managing a significant internal preoccupation. Vanessa, who was perceptive in the ways that people who've built a career reading situations and people are perceptive, had noticed and had asked, with the directness she'd always been good at, what was on his mind. He told her he'd been in contact with a son he'd only recently acknowledged, that the situation was complicated, that it had predated his marriage, that he was working through what it meant for his estate and his family structure going forward. Vanessa, by her own later account, felt the specific cold clarity of someone who is about to make a connection they cannot unmake. She asked the son's name. Richard, who had no reason at that point to understand why the name would matter to her specifically, told her, Daniel Marsh. She told me later, much later, in the kind of conversation that happens between people who've gone through something as strange as what we went through, who find themselves on the other side of it with no clean way to avoid the truth of what it was, that she sat across from Richard at that dinner table and felt the room reorganize itself around her in a way she hadn't felt since the day she'd decided to leave our kitchen. She said she excused herself, went to the bathroom, stood over the sink for several minutes, and looked at herself in the mirror in the particular way you look at yourself when you need to see your own face clearly before you can decide how to handle what you're feeling. What she was feeling, she said, was something she found difficult to name accurately. Not guilt, not exactly, not yet, but the specific vertiginous sensation of understanding that the geometry of the situation she was living in was considerably more complicated than she'd known when she'd entered it. She came back to the table. She didn't tell Richard that she knew me. She finished dinner. She drove home that night and called me at 10:30, which was the first time she'd called me outside of logistics since the divorce had been finalized. I was in bed, not yet asleep, and I looked at her name on the screen for a moment before I answered. I need to ask you something, she said without preamble, and I need you to tell me the truth. I generally do, I said. Richard Hartwell, she said. You know who he is. I know who he is, I said. He told me tonight that he has a son, she said. A son he's only recently acknowledged. He told me the son's name. A pause. Daniel, is he? Yes, I said. The silence on the other end of the line had a specific quality. The silence of someone absorbing something that is both completely surprising and, on reflection, not surprising at all, because the pieces were always there, and it just took the right moment for them to assemble themselves into the picture they'd always been making. How long have you known? She asked. About 3 weeks, I said. His attorney called. We've met twice. The DNA results came back confirmed last week. Another silence. You didn't tell me. It wasn't yours to know, I said, simply and without hostility. It was mine. My information about my family that I get to share or not share on my own timeline. She didn't argue with that. I think, to her credit, she understood it immediately and completely. Does Ethan know? She asked. Not yet, I said, when he's old enough to understand it properly. Right, she said. Then after a moment, Daniel, I don't know what to say. I don't know if there's anything to say. She stopped. This is an extraordinary situation. It is, I agreed. Are you? She paused, choosing carefully. How are you with it? Actually, I thought about that question for a moment because it was the first genuinely interested question she'd asked me in longer than I wanted to calculate. I'm figuring it out, I said honestly. It's a lot to hold, but I'm figuring it out. There was a long pause. I left you for your father, she said, and in her voice was something I recognized as the specific quality of someone hearing their own sentence out loud for the first time and understanding fully what it actually sounds like. "You didn't know," I said. "No," she said. "But it's still extraordinary," I said. "You said that." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, Daniel, for a lot of things. But specifically right now, I'm sorry you're dealing with something this significant and complicated on top of everything else." I appreciated that she said it, and I told her so, because I've found that acknowledging genuine moments is worth doing regardless of context. We hung up shortly after. I lay in the dark for a while, looking at the ceiling, turning the conversation over with the particular tired thoroughness of someone who has simply run out of the energy required to be surprised by anything. What happened between Vanessa and Richard in the weeks that followed, I know only in the broad outlines that eventually became relevant to other things. The relationship changed shape, not ended, or at least not immediately, but fundamentally altered by the specific, strange knowledge that the man she was with was the biological father of the man she'd left. The particular intimacy of a relationship that had felt, to her like a clean step forward into something new, had acquired a complication that couldn't be unfelt, a context that reshaped the thing it was attached to, whether or not anyone explicitly acknowledged it. I'm not going to claim satisfaction about that, because satisfaction would require me to have wanted her to be uncomfortable, and what I'd wanted, since the Tuesday morning with the note and the ring, was considerably simpler than that. I'd wanted to build a stable, good life for Ethan and myself. I was doing that. Everything else was simply what it was. What I will say is that when Eleanor Sims called me in early November to discuss the formal legal framework of Richard's revised estate documents, Vanessa's name appeared in the conversation in a way that told me something specific about how things had shifted. "Mr. Hartwell wants to be clear," Eleanor said, with the careful precision she brought to everything, "that the estate structure he's building is based entirely on family, on the family he has and the family he should have acknowledged earlier. He wants there to be no ambiguity about what that means and what it doesn't mean." I understood what she was telling me without her needing to make it explicit. What Richard had built over 20 years of focused, disciplined work was not going to be redirected by a relationship that had begun in his office, and that now, through circumstances nobody had anticipated, occupied a geometry too complicated to ignore. It was going to go where it had always, by rights and by blood, and by 38 years of absence, finally being addressed, been going, to his son, to me, and to Ethan, who had drawn a picture of the two of us in front of our house, hands raised, bigger than the house because that was the important part, who had no idea yet that the world he was growing up in had just gotten considerably larger, in ways that were going to take both of us some time to fully understand. The formal announcement that Richard had acknowledged a son came through Hartwell Capital's internal communications in mid-November, delivered by Eleanor Sims in the careful, specific language of a woman who understood that how something is said shapes what it means to the people receiving it. The announcement named me. It described, in broad, professional terms, the circumstances: a son acknowledged after many years, a matter now being addressed through the appropriate legal channels, a restructuring of the estate, and certain governance provisions within the firm to reflect the updated family picture. It did not name Vanessa. It did not describe the specific, extraordinary geometry of my relationship to her. It simply stated the facts that the firm's leadership needed to know, clearly and without embellishment. I'm told, by Margaret Hartwell, Richard's sister, who became unexpectedly and warmly present in my life over the weeks that followed and who had a gift for accurate, direct reporting that I found both useful and occasionally startling, that the announcement landed in Hartwell Capital's executive suite like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward from the point of impact in the particular, visible way of things that reorganize a room's understanding of itself. Vanessa, who received the announcement at the same time as everyone else, had known for 2 weeks. She'd had time to compose herself, to decide how she was going to carry the knowledge in a professional context, to build whatever internal structure she needed to sit in that executive suite and hear her own situation, described in language that named everyone clearly except the person it most directly implicated. She handled it, Margaret told me, with a composure that was genuinely impressive and that must have cost her considerably. She said nothing publicly. She congratulated Richard in the meeting that followed the announcement, in the measured professional tone of a senior member of his team, and returned to her office and closed the door. What happened between her and Richard in the weeks that followed is, I think, genuinely private, in a way that I'm not interested in dissecting. Not because I don't understand the shape of it, but because I've found that other people's reckonings are theirs to have, and that watching from the outside and narrating them serves nobody's dignity, including mine. What I know is that the relationship changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the gradual, fundamental way that things change when the context that made them possible shifts underneath them. The specific appeal of what Vanessa had found in Richard, the world he represented, the version of herself she became inside his orbit, the step forward into something that felt larger and more significant than the life she'd left, had acquired a complication it couldn't shed, because the life she'd left was now, irrevocably, part of the life she'd stepped into. The man whose world she'd entered was the father of the man she'd walked away from. That fact sat in every room they shared, whether or not either of them ever said it out loud, reshaping the thing it was attached to the way significant truths always reshape the things they're attached to. Her position at Hartwell Capital was not terminated. I want to be clear about that, because I think clarity matters here more than a tidier narrative would require. She was a good analyst, genuinely good, competent, in ways that existed entirely independently of her personal relationship with Richard, and that didn't disappear because the relationship had become complicated. The firm didn't lose a good employee because of the geometry of the situation. What changed was more subtle and, in some ways, more significant than a formal consequence would have been. The particular access she'd had, the client dinners, the strategy conversations, the proximity to Richard's decision-making that had been the real currency of her advancement, became less available. Not removed, not punished, just quietly, gradually less present. The way things become less present when the specific conditions that made them possible have changed. Margaret described it to me, with her characteristic directness, as a recalibration. Richard cares about her professionally, she told me, at a lunch that had become a regular occurrence as she and I found our footing as something resembling an aunt and nephew relationship. He's not going to harm her career. But the personal dimension has shifted, and the professional and personal were more connected than was probably wise. And now that the personal has shifted, the professional has had to adjust to reflect that. I asked Margaret, during one of our lunches, what she made of the whole situation. Not Vanessa specifically, the whole thing. The 38 years, the coffee shop, the DNA results, the extraordinary geometry of my former wife and my biological father. She thought about it for a moment, in the way she thought about things that deserved a real answer rather than a quick one. I think, she said finally, that my brother made a terrible choice 38 years ago and has been living inside the consequences of it ever since, in ways he didn't always let himself see clearly. And I think you've been living inside the consequences of it too, without knowing that's what you were doing. And I think what happened with Vanessa was incidental in the largest sense, not unimportant, not without its own real pain, but incidental to the larger story that was always going to have to be addressed eventually. The larger story being, I said, that you exist, she said simply, and that Richard is your father, and that those two facts were always going to require something from both of you, whether or not either of you knew it. I thought about that for a long time after that lunch. About the word incidental, not dismissive, but accurate, in the specific way that accurate words are sometimes uncomfortable. Vanessa's departure had felt, in the weeks after that Tuesday morning, like the central event, the organizing fact of what my life was becoming. It had turned out to be a side entrance into a much larger story that had been underway for 38 years without my knowledge. I didn't feel grateful for it. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story that wants to frame Vanessa's leaving as the thing that led Daniel to Richard, as if the departure was secretly a gift. It wasn't. It was a painful, specific loss that I wouldn't have chosen, and that cost Ethan something real that he's still, at 7 years old, quietly working out in drawings on his refrigerator. But I've arrived somewhere in the month since at a kind of understanding that doesn't require the loss to have been worth it in order to acknowledge what it led to. Some things lead to other things without justifying themselves. Some threads you didn't know were connected turn out to be connected anyway. That's not the universe offering a lesson. It's just the way things are sometimes, complicated and specific and impossible to fully account for in advance. Vanessa called me once more, about 2 months after the announcement, on a Sunday evening when Ethan was at his grandmother's, and I was alone in the house that was ours. Not about logistics, not about the divorce, not about Richard. She called, I think, because she needed to say something she hadn't found a way to say yet, and because I was the only person she could say it to who would fully understand what she meant. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what I told you, the last real conversation we had before I left. That I needed more than this. That I'd always needed more than this." "I remember," I said. "I think I was wrong," she said, not about the leaving, she was careful to say this, but about the diagnosis itself, about what more actually meant what she'd thought it was and what she'd been willing to exchange for it. "I think I confused something real. Ambition, wanting things, needing to be more than what our life allowed, with something that wasn't actually what I needed. And I think I understood that too late to do anything useful with the understanding." I sat with that for a moment. It was, I thought, the most honest thing she'd said to me in the last 2 years of our marriage and the year since. "I appreciate you saying it," I told her. "It doesn't fix anything," she said. "No," I agreed, "but it's still worth saying." We hung up, and I sat in the quiet of the house for a while and thought about what she'd said and about what it costs a person to arrive at a true understanding of themselves too late for the understanding to change the thing it's about. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and looked at Ethan's drawing on the refrigerator. The two of us, hands raised, bigger than the house because that was the important part, and felt, underneath everything else I was feeling, the particular, settled certainty of a man who knows, with complete clarity, what actually matters. There's a particular kind of clarity that arrives, I've found, not in the dramatic moments, but in the ordinary ones that come after them. The dramatic moments, the note on the kitchen counter, the coffee shop, the DNA results, Vanessa's 10:30 phone call. Those moments have a quality of unreality to them even as they're happening, a cinematic intensity that makes it hard to fully absorb what they mean until you're on the other side of them, back in the ordinary rhythms of a Tuesday morning and a school lunch that needs making, and a child who needs picking up at 3 o'clock. The clarity comes in the ordinary moments. I've been accumulating it, quietly, for the better part of a year. What I've come to understand about marriage, or specifically about what went wrong in mine, is something about the particular danger of ambition that doesn't know what it's actually for. Vanessa wanted more. That's true, and I don't think she was wrong to want it. Wanting more is not itself the problem, and I've spent enough time with the alternative reading of our marriage to know that reducing what she did to simple greed or selfishness doesn't actually explain it. She was a genuinely capable person who had built a life that was, in certain real ways, smaller than what she was capable of. And the particular frustration of being capable of more than your current life allows is a real thing that deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as ingratitude. What she got wrong, what I think she understood too late, sitting in the quiet of whatever she was sitting in when she called me on that Sunday evening, was what more actually meant. She'd been measuring it in the wrong units, square footage and country clubs, and the particular social access that comes from proximity to significant money. Those things are real, but they're the visible surface of something, not the thing itself. And when you mistake the surface for the substance, you end up in a beautiful room that turns out to be empty in the specific ways that matter most. What I had to offer Vanessa was not more of the visible kind. I'm a software engineer who works remotely, who picks his son up at 3 o'clock and makes school lunches and attends soccer games without exception. The life we built together was modest in the ways that lives built on one software salary and one analyst's salary are modest. I understand why that can feel insufficient when you're capable of more. What I had to offer her was the kind of knowing that takes years to build and can't be faked or accelerated. The specific, complete knowing of someone who has seen you through everything, including the unglamorous parts, including the ordinary Tuesday parts, and chosen you anyway, consistently, because choosing you is simply the thing they do. She traded that for a larger room. I've made my peace with her reasons, imperfect and human as they were. What I haven't made my peace with, and may not, is the specific cost of the trade. The Tuesday mornings, when Ethan asks where mommy is, the soccer games that have an empty spot in the bleachers where a parent should be, the quiet, ongoing adaptation of a 7-year-old learning not to expect something that isn't reliably there. That cost is real. I carry it, and I'll carry it, and I've decided the way to carry it is not as bitterness, but as a clear-eyed understanding of what actually matters that I intend to pass forward to my son. Which brings me to the second thing I've been thinking about fathers, about what one is and what it costs to be one, and what it costs not to be one. Richard Hartwell made a choice in 1985 that he's been living inside the consequences of for 38 years. I'm not going to tell you he's a bad man. I've come to know him well enough over the months since that coffee shop to understand that he's something more complicated than bad. He's a man who was afraid when he was 26 and acted from the fear rather than from the better version of himself that he would eventually become, and who has spent the better part of 4 decades understanding with increasing clarity exactly what that choice cost. What I've found, sitting across from him in that Myers Park study, is that the man he is now, the man who organized Eleanor Sims to find me, who sat in a coffee shop and said, "I'm your father," without embellishment or excuse, who is trying, inadequately and late but genuinely, to address what's addressable, is not the same man who left Raleigh in the fall of 1985. People change. I think that's worth saying plainly, without sentimentality, but also without the cynicism that makes it impossible to acknowledge. People change, actually and meaningfully, and the version of a person at 60 is not always the same as the version at 26. And sometimes the later version is genuinely better in ways that deserve to be taken seriously rather than dismissed, because the earlier version failed. I'm not forgiving Richard for 1985. I want to be honest about that. Forgiveness is a specific thing that I don't think I'm ready to offer yet, and I'm not going to perform it before it's real. But I'm choosing to engage with the man he actually is now rather than only the man he was then. Because engaging with only the past version would require me to reject something that's being offered in the present. And I've decided, carefully and without pressure from anyone, that what's being offered is worth accepting. He came to Ethan's soccer game last month. I'd told him about it, obliquely, in a conversation about what our relationship was going to look like practically. Not as an invitation exactly, but as an opening which he walked through with the careful, unhurried care of someone who understood that walking through it correctly mattered more than walking through it quickly. He sat 3 rows behind me in the bleachers. He didn't introduce himself to anyone. He watched Ethan play for 45 minutes with the particular focused attention of a man watching something he's been given access to late and intends to be fully present for. After the game, when Ethan ran over to me, sweaty and delighted in the way of a 7-year-old who'd scored a goal and needed to tell me about it approximately 6 consecutive times, I introduced them, casually, simply, without ceremony. "Ethan, this is Richard. He's a friend of mine." Ethan looked at him with the focused, evaluating attention he brought to new people, decided something, and extended his hand with the particular, formal seriousness of a child who'd been taught that handshakes meant something. "Hi," he said. "Did you see my goal?" "I did," Richard said, shaking his hand. "It was excellent." Ethan nodded, satisfied, and turned back to me with the next installment of the goal story, already having filed Richard into whatever internal category he'd assigned him. A friend of Dad's who'd come to the game, not yet anything more complicated than that. I looked at Richard over Ethan's head. He was looking at my son with an expression I recognized. The same expression I'd seen on his face in the coffee shop when I'd told him I needed to hear everything from the beginning, leave nothing out. The specific expression of a man understanding, fully and without any remaining distance, what 38 years of choosing fear over the right thing had actually cost. He wasn't going to undo that. Neither of us was going to undo any of it. Vanessa's departure, the 38 years, the note on the kitchen counter, the soccer games with an empty bleacher spot, none of it was going to be undone. But Ethan was 7 years old, and Richard was 60, and I was 38, and what was in front of us was not the past, but the specific, ordinary Tuesday that comes after all of it. The lunch that needs making, the pickup at 3 o'clock, the drawing on the refrigerator, the next soccer game, and the one after that. I've decided to be present for all of it. That's the lesson, if there is one, that I want to carry forward and pass to my son. Not the dramatic version, not the extraordinary geometry of what happened, but the simple, daily version. That showing up, consistently and without reservation, for the people who need you to show up is the whole of it. Everything else, the ambition, the inheritance, the 38 years, the note on a kitchen counter, is the context that surrounds that simple thing. The thing itself is just show up, be there, do it every day. That's what I'm doing. That's what I intend to keep doing in the ordinary Tuesdays that stretch out in front of Ethan and me for as long as I'm given to do it. Ethan turned 7 in February, 4 months after everything changed. I made his birthday dinner myself. His request, which was spaghetti and meatballs from scratch, a dish he decided was his favorite the previous year, and had requested with the solemn certainty of a child who understands that favorites are serious business. We ate at the kitchen table, the two of us, with the drawing still on the refrigerator and the February evening coming down quiet and dark outside the window. After dinner, he brought out a new drawing been working on for a week, which he presented with the same flat, careful formality he'd always used for things he considered finished and important. It was the same house as the other drawing. Recognizable, the same roof shape, the same tree, the same number on the mailbox. But this time there were 3 figures in front of it instead of 2. Still 2 sizes, still with their hands raised, still bigger than the house, because that was the important part. But in the background, slightly smaller, slightly separate, there was a third figure, not quite inside the house picture, not quite outside it, positioned at the edge of the frame in the particular way of someone who is present without yet being fully accounted for. "Who's that?" I asked, pointing to the third figure. Ethan looked at the drawing for a moment, considering his answer with the thoroughness he brought to questions he wanted to answer accurately. "That's the new person," he said. "I don't know yet where he goes exactly, so I put him at the edge for now." I looked at my son across the kitchen table, 7 years old, working out the geometry of his expanding world the only way he knew how, by drawing it until it made sense. "That seems right," I told him. "The edge is a good place to start." He nodded, satisfied, and went to put the new drawing on the refrigerator next to the old one. 2 drawings side by side. The first one, just the 2 of us, bigger than the house. The second one, the 2 of us, and a third figure at the edge. The picture still in progress, the composition not yet complete. I've thought about those 2 drawings a great deal in the months since February. About what it means to add someone to a picture that was already whole, not to complete something that was missing, because what Ethan and I had built in the house was genuinely complete, sufficient, whole in all the ways that matter, but to expand it, to make room at the edge for something that wasn't there before, and that might, with time and care, and the ordinary accumulation of soccer games and dinners and conversations at kitchen tables, eventually find its way toward the center. Richard comes to the soccer games now. Everyone, without exception, which is more than I would have required of him, and which I've come to understand, is his way of showing me, in the only language that matters, that he understands what showing up actually means. He sits in the bleachers and watches my son play and doesn't ask for more than that, which is exactly the right amount to ask for at this stage of a relationship that is being built from scratch, with 38 years of absence as its foundation. We have dinners, occasionally, the 3 of us, Richard, Ethan, and me, at a restaurant Ethan chooses because he takes the responsibility of restaurant selection very serious. Ethan has decided that Richard is Dad's old friend who likes soccer. which is accurate in the ways it needs to be accurate for a 7-year-old, and which we've agreed, Richard and I, to let stand until Ethan is old enough for the fuller version of the truth. My mother came for a visit in March. She and Richard have not met. That's a conversation that hasn't happened yet, that I think both of them are circling from a careful distance, understanding that when it happens, it will require something from both of them that they need to be ready for. I'm not going to rush it. Some things need to arrive in their own time. Vanessa sees Ethan every other weekend. She comes to more soccer games than she did in the months immediately after she left, which Ethan has noticed and which I've been glad to see. Whatever is happening in her life, and I know only the broad outlines now, which is the appropriate amount, she seems to be finding her way toward a version of motherhood that is more present than the early months suggested it would be. I'm grateful for that, for Ethan's sake, without any remaining attachment to what it means for anything else. The estate matters are being handled by Eleanor Sims with the quiet, precise efficiency that appears to be her defining professional quality. I've retained my own attorney, as Richard insisted, and the two of them are working through the framework of what it means to acknowledge a son at 60 when you've spent 38 years not acknowledging him. It's complex, legally and otherwise, and I've decided not to hurry it because the money, and there is significant money, more than I've let myself fully absorb yet, is real but secondary to the other thing, which is simply the relationship itself, built one soccer game and one kitchen table dinner at a time. I'm a software engineer who picks his son up at 3 o'clock. That hasn't changed. The work is the same, the pickup is the same, the lunch is the same, the house is the same house, with the same drawing on the refrigerator, 2 drawings now, side by side, the second one still in progress, the third figure still at the edge, finding his way toward wherever he ends up. What's different is the size of the world Ethan is growing up in. Larger than I knew it was. When I was making his lunch, on that first Tuesday morning, steadier than it felt when Vanessa's ring was in the junk drawer, more complicated and more full than either of us had planned for, which is, I've come to believe, exactly how it should be. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt true to something you know or have known, I'd love for you to tell me what it was. Subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment below. What does showing up actually look like in your own life? Because I think that's the whole question, and I read every answer.